If you're asking a question about, how does the inside of a cell figure out how to make proteins, that's a science question. But if you're asking a question like, is there a God? Or why am I here? Science has nothing to say. And don't you want to be able to ask all the questions? Wisdom isn't just knowledge. Wisdom has to add other insights from experience, from common sense, from moral compass, to put aside your normal reaction, which is to be defensive and sort of marshal your arguments to tell this other person why they're flat wrong, which that's the worst possible way. Try to convince somebody that you're right and they're wrong.
The best way to convince someone is to listen.
But we haven't really been very good at that lately. It seems like every argument turns into a shouting match instead of an opportunity to listen, understand, and maybe even make a new friend.
You're listening to the INNERCALLING podcast. My guest today is Dr. Francis Collins. Dr. Collins is a physician scientist who discovered the gene for cystic fibrosis, led the Human Genome Project, which successfully sequenced all 3 billion letters of our DNA. And he served as the director of the National Institutes of Health. But he's also a musician, motorcycle rider, cancer survivor, and a Christian. I invited him to the show today because he's been a profound inspiration in my own life. In my 20s, while I was struggling with depression, I read Dr. Collins' book, The Language of God. And at a time when I was really searching for answers and struggling, it introduced me to the idea that science itself could be a doorway to a deeper sense of awe, wonder, and mystery. And it just expanded my understanding of mental health by making room for the human spirit. Today, we're going to be talking about his latest book, The Road to Wisdom, on truth, science, faith, and trust. Welcome, Dr. Collins.
Thank you very much.
Can you tell us about a time that you had an inner calling? And maybe it didn't make sense to anyone else around you, but you followed it, and where did it lead?
Going back to childhood, I was not raised in a family where spirituality was considered particularly worth consideration, but I was very much in a circumstance where music and theater were part of what I was exposed to a lot, because my dad was a college professor and a folk song collector. My mother was a playwright, and so the arts and music were a big part of my life. And there were occasional moments where something happened in the midst of a musical experience that felt this intense kind of longing. Couldn't put words to it exactly. It was an ache, but it was also the sweetest kind of feeling of being lifted outside of yourself by beauty, in that case, beauty of music, and just feeling like, I think I'm made for something more than just the dailiness of life experience. There's something I'm called to be part of, but I don't know what it is, and I don't know how to put a name to it. And after a while, I would move on to whatever I was doing, which was more of a practical sort. But those moments would occasionally happen, oftentimes, and the exposure to a beautiful musical performance, either something happening live or something that I listened to on the radio or heard on a record.
Where do you feel like those moments of, would you call it transcendence?
Yeah, I would call it that.
Where do you feel like they were leading you, or where did they ultimately lead you in your life?
It took a while. It felt like a calling to something that I couldn't explain in a purely materialistic worldview. And yet I had a pretty materialistic worldview growing up. I didn't go to school till the 6th grade. My parents taught me at home because they thought they were better teachers than the local county schools. And then in high school, I fell in love with science in a chemistry class taught by a very talented teacher who helped me and the other people in the class understand that science is like a detective story. Mm-hmm. There's nature out there waiting to be understood. And science is the way, with the appropriate tools, that you can actually figure out how things work. There's truth that can be uncovered, but you have to be careful about how you do it because it's easy to be misled. And I thought, that's what I want to do. Now, mind you, that was also a materialistic kind of pursuit. Science, in its most exclusive kind of form, becomes its own version of a worldview that excludes anything that science can't measure. And I would call that scientism, not science, but it was pretty much the attitude that I had developed. So I majored in chemistry in college. I went on to enroll in graduate school at Yale to get a PhD in chemistry, and pretty much excluded from my consideration any of those other transcendental experiences as, some little misfiring of a neurotransmitter that I could probably best ignore.
Yeah. And then science reached its limit for you.
It did, in a way that I was unprepared for, but for which I will always be grateful that this scientism attitude that I adopted turned out to be impoverished. And I found that out not studying physical chemistry, but going to medical school.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I realized in graduate school, I'd kind of ignored life science because it seemed really messy.
Yeah.
And by the way, it is. I liked the very precise approaches of physics and chemistry and mathematics. But I realized there were some exciting things happening in human science based on this information molecule called DNA,
Yeah.
which after all was also a chemical. And I felt like, okay, I think I need to change my whole pathway to take whatever tools I might have learned about science and apply them to this circumstance of understanding how human life works and maybe how you can help people who are struggling with illness. So I went to medical school and I sustained my materialism quite well for the first year or two, which is mostly about sitting in a lecture hall. And then that third year of medical school at the University of North Carolina, it's now the real world. And you are out there in the hospital wards with patients, and many of them are suffering from pretty terrible diseases. And many of them, it was pretty clear, we were not going to save them by what we were offering, maybe provide some respite. But many of these were folks who were looking at the end of their life. And that made me uneasy because I didn't like considering my own mortality, even though I'd gone to medical school. I thought I could insulate myself from that. It's really hard when day after day you're encountering these wonderfully interesting, often really dedicated, noble North Carolina residents who are facing the end of their physical life. And I had to wonder, how will I handle that? Science didn't help me with a good answer to that. But I had this moment, Victoria, which I will always remember, where my materialism suddenly fell apart. Sitting at the bedside of an elderly woman with really bad heart disease, for which we didn't have much in the way of answers, and who suffered from really awful episodes of chest pain, and yet got through them not because of anything I had to offer as her assigned medical student, but on the basis of her faith. And that was puzzling. And she would talk to me about her faith, and I would sit awkwardly and not know what to say because I thought this is all a big psychological crutch. And it seemed to work for her. But I was totally skeptical. Yeah. And then that one afternoon, after one of those episodes, she again shared her faith with me and then stopped and said, doctor, I've shared my faith in Jesus with you, and you never say anything. What do you believe? Such a simple question. What do you believe? Stop a moment and ask yourself, if you were asked that question right now, what would you say?
Right.
I realized I have nothing. I stammered something like, well, I really don't know. And I saw this look of surprise in her eyes. Not that she was being critical, but she was just surprised. You haven't thought about that? You don't have any answer at all? That was the moment I realized I have completely ignored some of the most fundamental questions because I didn't think they were relevant, because they didn't fit in my materialistic worldview, but they were probably the most important questions. Why am I here? What's the meaning of life? Does God exist? What happens after you die? All of those questions suddenly sort of seemed very prominent in front of me, and I realized I'm lost, and I better start figuring out whether there might be some answers there. And maybe right at that moment, I can't quite remember, were those transcendental experiences of being aware of some calling to be something other than just atoms and molecules, maybe that was also calling to me in ways that I had ignored. Because ultimately, that really does feel to me like all part of the same message.
Well, I want to really thank you for writing this book because it's a really interesting question during these times is how do we integrate truth, science, faith, and trust? How can they all lead us on a road to wisdom? And what caught my eye about this book was the title, the word wisdom. How did you come up with that title?
It was a struggle because I had kind of skirted around the use of the word wisdom. It made me uneasy that people would think, oh, I've got it all figured out. I will be your source. No, 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 no. The point really was to say, I'm on this road too. But maybe there's some insight from my experience as a scientist, as a person of faith, as a person who's watched what's happening to our society right now, our communities, where we seem to have lost a lot of our love for each other and a lot of our willingness to believe in truth as something that really matters. Because wisdom isn't just knowledge. Wisdom has to add other insights from experience, from common sense, from moral compass. Knowledge doesn't necessarily offer you that. If it's wisdom that you're after, science alone can't get you.
That's what I really loved about their book, the emphasis on wisdom. And I found reading the book rather comforting. It was like a therapy session with a leader who was helping us process what is going on in the world today. What particularly struck me was the tone you took when writing it. It was humble and it was modest. And I realized it'd been a long time since I'd really listened or heard any leader write in such a way. In your book, you share many different stories and from your life of failures or times you didn't get things right. And that was also really helpful.
Well, thank you for saying so. I'm so brokenhearted by the way in which I see the divisiveness, the polarization, the blame game, the looking for scapegoats. I mean, it is so pervasive these days. And maybe as a effort to counter that, trying to reveal all of my own shortcomings, which are numerous, and not portray this as like, I've got the answer, so you have to listen to me. We get enough of that already every time you look at social media or listen to some politician. So yeah, thanks. I appreciate what you said about the tone. I really tried to make that part of the point.
It really struck me, and I think it's very much needed right now because so many of my patients and people I see, we're all really struggling to process what exactly is going on in our country. And I work with many young adults who are feeling powerless. They care very much about truth. They care about science, but with the powerlessness, it makes you feel numb and paralyzed.
Yeah.
In your book, there's some actionable things that we can each do to help promote greater wisdom in our society.
Well, no, I wanted not to just be a diagnostician here, but it also provides some ideas about therapy for our society, because we are at a tough time here. All of the cohesiveness that you would have hoped we would have built over time has shown all these fractures within it, driven by all kinds of forces, politics being a big one, become so identified with political positions that we not only are likely to accept a claim by somebody who's on the same side as us, but likely to reject a claim from somebody who's on the other side, even though it might be something we really need to hear.
Right.
Everything is sort of falling into bubbles that we occupy or the tribal alliances that we have all found ourselves in. And it's pervasive. Folks are really caught up in this difficult circumstance of wondering, how do I help? What do I do? I think a lot of the country is in what the book calls the exhausted middle.
Yeah.
Just sort of not over there on the fringes. If you don't go with my political answer, then it's going to be worse. Most people are like, no, I don't believe in that. But what has happened to us? So yeah, there is a recommendation. There's even a pledge at the end of the book.
I know.
People might consider taking, which is available on the website for Braver Angels, which is an organization I belong to. Basically asking people to do a couple things. One is to basically, instead of demonizing somebody who doesn't agree with you about some issue like immigration or gun control or abortion or any one of those issues that seems to get us all heated up, really make a resolution to try to understand where those people are coming from. Say, let's go for coffee or a glass of wine. We used to be people who could talk to each other. Tell me exactly why you've come to this perspective on, say, immigration. I really want to listen. I don't want to listen to plan my response to tell you you're wrong. I want to listen to understand why, from your background and the influences that have had some consequence for you, you've arrived at this conclusion. And I'm going to listen to you so well that after you tell me the answer, I'm going to say back to you, here's what I heard you say. And then you're going to check me out and see if I got it right. Sounds like marriage counseling, doesn't it?
Listening is highly undervalued in our society.
Especially now, we've become really lousy at this. So that's one thing, because I don't think we're going to solve the divisiveness in our society because our politicians decide to fix it. They're more divided than we are. And the media is certainly not helping, especially social media. It's got to come down to we, the people, deciding to make this a priority, to build those bridges, maybe one at a time or in community groups or book clubs or whatever. Other thing I'd like for people to do is to be more precise in their own assessment about incoming information, because we are so susceptible, you know this as a mental health expert, to messages that make us fearful or angry. They just like grab our attention. Messages that are actually about truth that is not very controversial, well, that goes right by. But because anger and fear are so powerful, we tend, as a species, to adopt messages like that as if they were actually reliable. And many of the times they're not. And our filtering system for telling the difference between a fact and a fake has gotten a little bit shabby. And we really need to work on that, especially in the era of social media, which is just full of people who are trying to fill your head with misinformation or even make a buck by sending you information that's just demonstrably false. So how do we do a better job of not being cynical, not being skeptical about everything? I kind of think this is like building your mental immune system. So you're prepared for an invading viral information source. It's just not good for you. And you've kind of got yourself ready for that. So you recognize it and you fight it off. But you don't want to overdo it, because then you have an autoimmune disease where you're rejecting everything and then becoming pretty much discouraged, almost in anarchy. But to have a healthy immune system, preparing you for the fact that a lot of stuff you're going to see today is probably not true, and being ready to sort through that. There are reliable sources. Part of that is coming back to actually putting value on expertise.
Yeah, it's disappearing.
Yeah, because expertise in a lot of people's minds is associated with elitism. And so a lot of folks would be more willing to accept a claim on social media that just sounds right from somebody who has really no expertise versus somebody who spent their whole life working on the problem and is trying to tell you, maybe in not the most articulate way, what the true facts are, and can be dismissed as, oh, that's an academic elitist, probably not somebody I should pay any attention to. Figuring out, how do you do that? How do you decide who to trust? Is this a source that has integrity? Do they have competence? Do they have humility? Does this source share my values? That's not an unreasonable thing to put on your list of criteria. But when we are in the current circumstance, where everything practically is surrounding this issue about which tribe are you in, that idea of sharing my values sort of overrules all the rest and may allow you to feel good accepting information from somebody in your tribe that's really not true. And once you start building that into your house of cards, becomes very hard to assess truth anymore.
Well, what I really appreciated was your message that if you are feeling exhausted and exhausted middle, you're not alone, that actually we are the majority.
Yes.
That was very encouraging. And also the message that if you are in the exhausted middle, there are things that you can do and take action on. I was also surprised to learn about organizations like Braver Angels, which are trying to help with the increasing division and polarization in society.
Yeah. I continue to learn from them. I'll be going to
Yeah.
their national convention in Philadelphia in a couple of weeks. Just a remarkable gathering. And the topics are all pretty much hot button topics, but there are ground rules that while you can speak bluntly your opinion and defend it, you don't engage in ad hominem attacks of people who have a different view. And I have learned so much from those conversations. The first time I went to a Braver Angels discussion, I encountered a fellow named Wilk Wilkins, who ran a trucking company in Minnesota. And this was all about the response to the COVID pandemic and was it handled properly? And as somebody who was the director of the National Institutes of Health in 2020 and 2021, during a lot of the decision making about COVID, I obviously had some role in this. And Wilk was furious about a number of the recommendations that had been made and was very clear about that the government was basically irresponsible. They were pushing people around. There's all this stuff about social distancing and masking and even vaccines was just not well described. And there was probably a lot of manipulation going on. It was really hard to listen to that.
Yeah.
But it was so important because he had a point in a number of the arguments about how we manage this crisis. It was a crisis and didn't give us the opportunity to study the situation for a year or two before making a recommendation. We had to make a lot of these recommendations on the fly. But I could see how, from his perspective in Middle America, a lot of this didn't make a lot of sense. Pulling his kids out of school when in his community, there hadn't even been a case of COVID yet. So I learned a lot from Wilk, and over time, he got, I think, also some helpful input from me. It was a mutual back and forth about recognizing that some of our opinions probably didn't reflect reality in quite the way that we thought they did. And he and I are really good friends now. I still think he's wrong about stuff, and he thinks I'm wrong about stuff, but we can talk about that.
What was the skill you used in really hearing him?
Oh boy, it was a force of determined will to put aside your normal reaction, which is to be defensive and sort of marshal your arguments to tell this other person why they're flat wrong, which that's the worst possible way to try to convince somebody that you're right and they're wrong.
The best way to convince someone is to listen.
It's to listen. But we haven't really been very good at that lately. It seems like every argument turns into a shouting match instead of an opportunity to listen, understand, and maybe even make a new friend.
Well, how do you personally set aside your defensiveness, especially when someone's coming at you about COVID-19?
Yeah. It does require a certain force of will, not to let the lizard brain kick in before your prefrontal cortex has a chance to think through what is this situation? What can I learn here? Well, let me suppress some sort of base instincts and try to tap into something more significant. And we haven't talked much about how faith plays into this, Victoria, but I think for me, having come to faith at age 27 and having that kind of perspective, which means it's not all about me.
Right.
I'm not here to be a promoter who's going to knock aside anybody who doesn't agree with me in order to show I'm the true alpha person. No, the true alpha person is Jesus. And if I'm going to perform any kind of useful role, I'm here as a follower of Jesus. It is to avoid that tendency to try to say I'm right and everybody else is wrong. So yeah, faith is so important in helping me have the right perspective in a difficult situation and not feeling like I've got to be focused only on myself. I still fail at that sometimes, I will admit, but I have a foundation that brings me back to a healthier place if I can just tap back into that.
That's where I felt like your book was especially powerful. I see a lot of young adults who are really struggling with what you referred to earlier as materialism, which is reducing everything to just what you see and material, just what can science prove, and that's it. Like a very atheistic kind of worldview. And just a lot of struggling with powerlessness, existential crisis. So that's why hearing you talk about your faith and how it helped you bridge beyond just materialism into things that are very human Like the human to human connection, compassion, those are actually not things in the realm of materialism. They're actually in the realm of spirituality and faith. It gives those of us who are very committed to science permission to explore spirituality and realize it's actually not crazy to explore the wonders and mystery of nature. I'm wondering if you could share a couple stories from your life where you experienced that bridge between science, your discoveries with DNA, faith, awe, and mystery.
And some of this sort of goes back to that 2 years where I was struggling after that patient asked me, "What do you believe?" to see whether there was any kind of logical way to consider the possibility of a spiritual calling, even though I was not about to walk away from science as a way of discovering truth about nature. And you know what, Victoria, is interesting. Once I allowed myself that opportunity to take off those blinders, it was pretty clear there were things about my scientific interests that were also pointing to a creator that I could not explain on purely materialistic grounds. The Big Bang, that the universe had a beginning, a singularity out of nothing in an unimaginable way. Matter and energy came into being and has been flying apart ever since over the last 13.55 billion years. Nature has not been observed to create itself. So how could that happen? You have to postulate that there is something outside of nature, that would be called supernatural, that made this possible, and which is itself not limited by space and time, because otherwise you haven't solved the problem of who created the creator. But if the creator is outside of space and time, it needs not answer that requirement. So, okay, that's interesting. And then, I had been a physical chemist. I had studied all of the amazing mathematics that determines the behavior of matter and energy. I loved Maxwell's equations that describe electromagnetism.
I love your passion.
they were not just elegant, they were beautiful.
Yeah.
What
was beautiful about them?
Their symmetry, their simplicity, just like jaw-dropping, that electromagnetism follows these rules. Why should that be? What it calls out the idea the creator must have been a mathematician.
Was there an order and elegance?
The universe follows these laws about order. I mean, take simple ones like gravity. Why should gravity follow an inverse square for the distance between two objects? But it does. All of this seemed to be an indication that there's a mind behind the universe. And then most stunning of all, and I'd never heard this until I was on this journey towards trying to discover whether I could possibly believe in something outside of science. Those laws that determine the behavior of matter and energy, like gravity, for instance, they have constants in them. The gravitational constants. Suppose it was a little different. What kind of universe would that be? Turns out it doesn't work anymore. That even a tiny increase or decrease in the gravitational constant, or about a half dozen other constants, result in a universe that has nothing interesting about it. Just maybe some particles flying apart, and that's about it. Any kind of complexity of life would be impossible unless those constants have exactly the value they do.
Like there wouldn't be galaxies or stars or anything?
No. If gravity's a little stronger than it is, you might have been able to get coalition of stars and gas and planets, but it would all have a short life because it would come back together because of the gravity in a big crunch. There would be no time for things like us to appear.
What are the chances that everything had to come together the way it did to make the Big Bang?
Astronomically unlikely. So you're stuck with two possibilities. One is the dials were set by an intelligence who wanted the universe to be interesting. And the atheists don't like that one. So the other alternative is, let's postulate that there's an infinite number of other universes out there, which we will never be able to observe, And they have different values of these constants. But because we're here, we're in the one where everything worked. So which of those requires more faith? I had to struggle with that. And there it had been right in front of me all along as a guy who loved physical sciences. So even Einstein would have agreed that points to a creator.
Even Einstein would? How do you know?
Oh, well, he was a deist.
Oh.
What he didn't like is the idea that the creator cared about human beings. Stephen Hawking, the famous Stephen Hawking atheist, was not really an atheist. He was a deist also struck by this fine tuning of the universe. But how do you then get from there to the idea of a God who's a theist kind of God, that is, has interest in humans, and we should try to develop a relationship? And I found two signposts that brought me there, although they're not proofs. One of them is beauty. Those transcendental experiences, they don't really make that much sense.
No, they don't.
If you're in the laboratory and you discover some new phenomenon about life science, oftentimes it's not just like really cool, it's beautiful. I don't think I can just dismiss that as some sort of misfiring, as I once did, of a neurotransmitter. That's really significant stuff. When I hear the second movement of Beethoven's Third Symphony, the Eroica, and that second movement gets played and that C minor chord starts out, I know I'm going to lose it. It's just, I will remember hearing that for the first time in 1972, played by the Berlin Symphony Orchestra in an incredibly emotional, tragic moment after the Olympic athletes had been killed in the 72 Olympics in Berlin. And those strains of that C minor piece will always bring up in me something that I can't put a finger to. And the other is morality. Why do we as humans, and this is true of every human society that we have any information about, have this idea that there's right and wrong, and that we're supposed to do the right thing, even though we often fail at it? Could even call it a moral law, but it's a law that we break. But it's powerful when you think about it, because it is written into our hearts, isn't it? The sense that we are supposed to be good, honorable people and stay away from evil. And when we actually break the law, what do? We come up with an excuse, which only says we believe in the law. So how does that explain the kind of radical altruism that we are called sometimes to do, where people even consider risking their life to save somebody they don't even know?
Yeah.
Oscar Schindler. And what happens, Victoria, when we see things like that? We admire that. We say to ourselves, that's the kind of noble action that we humans ought to do more of. From a purely evolutionary argument, it's a scandal that you would engage in that kind of altruism. We're wired to believe that's the right thing. If you were looking for a signpost to a God who's not just a mind behind the mechanics of creation, but a God who is holy, and a God who's interested in us and wanting us also to try to be holy, there it is. That stunned me when I first began to realize that had been in front of me all this time, and I'd never paid attention. And now it all kind of fell together. And I know that people go, well, that must mean that you have sort of walled off parts of your life and maybe even your brain, where you have the spiritual part and you have the scientific part.
It's all integrated.
You got to be really careful that they don't bump into each other. No.
It sounds very integrated to me.
Totally integrated. I mean, think about that. In the laboratory, what are you doing? You're investigating God's creation.
What about the institution of religion and people stopping believing in that and having trouble engaging with the church anymore? Like, you have to leave behind spirituality. And then it goes back to the materialism of just like, oh, this is all it is. The world is falling apart.
It is troubling to see the way in which the pure spiritual truths of faith, as I understand it anyway, are not always what comes across when people are considering what does the church stand up for. Churches, like the rest of society, have gotten in some ways contaminated by other messages that are not loving, but are much more about promoting yourself. and your tribe. When I see so many young people now stepping away, they're not reacting, I don't think, to the real truths, to that pure spiritual water. They're reacting to the water after it's been put in these dirty vessels called human beings. And that's heartbreaking to see that the real solid foundation has oftentimes gotten lost in all the contaminating noise. What's the perspective you see right now of Christianity in public course? It's narrow-minded, it's critical, it's unloving, it's often hypocritical. Why would I want to be one of those?
Exactly.
The person of Jesus is the opposite of all those things, but that gets lost.
What advice do you have for people who are interested in exploring their spirituality and who value science and truth and trust?
That there's good news here. That despite what seems to be the majority view that, faith and science are going to be locked eternally in a battle for which one is true, that they're both true, but they need to be considered in the circumstance of which kind of question are you asking? Mm-hmm. If you're asking a question about, how does the inside of a cell figure out how to make proteins? That's a science question. That can be answered scientifically. Probably not a place to go to the books in the Bible and say, can I find the answer there? But if you're asking a question like, is there a God? Or why am I here? Science has nothing to say pretty much about that. And don't you want to be able to ask all the questions?
But wouldn't the scientists say, well, there's just no proof there is a God, so there is no God or something like that?
Well, yeah.
I feel like I hear a lot of people who say that.
Yeah. Is there proof for love? Do we say, therefore, there is no such thing as love? Mm-hmm. That kind of argument smacks of the scientism, what would be called metaphysical naturalism, where you have by first definitions that there is nothing that's worth even considering that science can't measure. Yeah. Well, you just excluded a whole lot of the most important parts of human existence, like love, truth, beauty, and goodness. I don't think that's a happy place for people to be. And yet a lot of folks are there. I would give a resource for people who are interested in a community that's wrestling with how science and faith can fit together. And that's an organization that I actually started some 15 or 16 years ago called BioLogos, BIOLOGOS. Go to the web and you'll see. And BioLogos has a community now, a couple million people who are deeply engaged in thoughtful civil discourse about areas where science and faith have something to say to each other, or maybe where there's a perceived conflict, and how do you kind of start to work that through? A wonderful community. I've learned a lot from that conversation. They have also face-to-face meetings. They have lots of materials, including a curriculum for high school kids that are raised in traditional Christian homes and are trying to figure out how science and faith fit together.
And as we've lost trust in religious institutions, there's also been a loss of community.
Yes.
And so in your book, you talk about how instrumental it was for you early on to have a faith community to help you along. Do you have any advice for people who are currently looking for community?
Yeah, it's the right thing to do for starters. It's if you're going to really have an experience of fellowship, of intimacy with other people with whom you can share not just the things you're proud of, but the things you're struggling with. It takes a community of some sort. Churches can provide that, especially if they have small group settings to allow that sort of thing. But it's not the only place. I'm in a book club, by the way. This book club's been going on for 7 or 8 years. It's a group of about 12 of us. In this case, it's all men. These have become my closest friends. The book club picks really tough things to read. We read Dostoevsky.
What are you guys reading right now?
Interesting. We have book club tomorrow night. We are reading Pope Leo's encyclical.
Oh, really?
Which has a lot to say about AI and how that impacts our view of humanity. And it's 43,000 words, so it's not like a quick read, but it's deeply interesting. And of course, for me, somebody who really values the faith perspective in things that are happening scientifically, it's right in that zone. He has got a lot of insights there that I am enjoying. And I'm sure we'll have an intense discussion about it tomorrow night. The last month, we read Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. That book's been out since the 50s. And it's incredibly powerful, his story of his own experience during the Holocaust, and how he survived, and how he saw that even at that point, those who could still see a purpose and a meaning in their life in the darkest of possible circumstances survived. And those who didn't often did not. And he comes out of that, of course, with an argument as a psychiatrist about really that is the point of our existence. It's not about riches. It's not about fame. It's not about happiness in the sense of self-indulgence. It's about meaning. That's what we're all looking for. How do I find meaning for my life? How can I find a purpose that's bigger than just me? We're all longing for that. That's another signpost to the fact that God is asking us for a relationship, because that's oftentimes where the meaning begins to make sense.
So do you feel like if people engage with faith more, that it would help with some of the things going on in society today?
Absolutely. If it's the authentic faith, the faith that says, what are the greatest commandments? Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength and all your mind. Mind is in that line too, which I think is really interesting.
Well, what keeps you hopeful? Because you've been working at the highest levels of leadership and you've seen so many things. What keeps you hopeful and positive?
Yeah, and it's a good question, because I have to tell you right now, Victoria, when I spent most of my life working in medical research, trying to advance our understanding of the human body and how life works and how disease happens and what to do about it. And it's been this fantastic journey with achievements that I didn't think would happen in my lifetime. My lab discovered the cause of cystic fibrosis more than 30 years ago. And now, as a result of that, people who have that condition, who have access to this amazing drug called Trikafta, are planning for retirement instead of an early funeral. People with stage 4 cancer, based on immunotherapy approaches, many of them getting into a clinical trial and finding out maybe they don't have to put their affairs in order after all. Maybe there's a long-term future, maybe even a cure for what we used to think was, okay, that's the end. All of that's happening. And yet, at the moment, for reasons that are mostly political, that engine of discovery is having a lot of sand thrown in the gears. A lot of that research is being stopped or slowed down. Clinical trials that were middle of the way to making some kind of insights are being terminated. Young scientists are really troubled about whether there's a pathway for them to pursue their dreams in the United States of America. It is a really troubling time, pretty much unprecedented. And it is hard sometimes, because this is something I care deeply about, not to get discouraged. But no, hope is still the right answer. Hope that's attached to action, hope that leads us in a place of getting to better answers than the ones we have right now. And right now, I've started a new nonprofit organization that is collecting amazing stories from individuals all over the country who have had the experience of encountering a significant medical problem. And then because of research, finding there might be an answer to that. And now they want to tell you their story about what's happened. And the more of those stories that get heard out there by the exhausted middle, then I think perhaps that's a way to counter what's otherwise the distrust of science, which is more widespread than ever, the cynicism about institutions, which includes scientists, the distrust of expertise. All of those things are going the wrong way. And yet, if we want to see the next breakthroughs for Alzheimer's disease, for instance, or diabetes, or a lot of these rare diseases that have no answers, this can be the time for that to happen. But we've got to get ourselves back on a better track. And it gives me hope to see some glimmers that's starting to get some traction. If you get involved, then you can sort of say, okay, I'm going to be a small part, but at least I'm doing something.
Right. Hope comes from taking action. Yeah.
It does.
And what's your new nonprofit called?
It's called Discovery Lives in Us.
Discovery Lives in Us.
Yeah, it's not yet public. It will be in the next month or so. So anybody listening to this, watch for Discovery Lives in Us. And maybe if you've got a story to tell, you can add yours to this story bank. It's not political. It's not aiming to attack anything or anybody. It's like, this is an amazing moment and something we should all feel proud of, that America has led the world in these kinds of breakthroughs for several decades. Let's not step back now. Let's step forward.
Thank you very much, Dr. Collins. Thank you very much for your time today.
It's been great talking to you, Victoria. We could go on a long time.
I know we could. Thank you very much.
Thanks for what you're doing.
If you'd like to support the show, the most helpful way would be to subscribe on Apple Podcasts or YouTube or Spotify. It would just be awesome if you could also share an episode that you found helpful with a friend. That would help spread the word about INNERCALLING and helps us make the show better for you each time. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you have a beautiful day.